So joining us here on this Ben Shapiro Show special, we're doing Facebook Live with Edward Feser. Professor Feser is an author and associate professor of philosophy at Pasadena City College in California. If you've been watching the show, you know that I've quoted him routinely in the last couple of weeks since I had the opportunity to read a couple of his books. His latest book is 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. He's one of the few writers on philosophy who can actually write, which is a relief. I mean, you actually read his books and they are full of words that you understand, and are not written in the jargon of Immanuel Kant. You can find him online at edwardfeser.com, Feser.com. Professor Feser, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on.
I want to start off by asking you. You talk a little bit in your books, really in the introduction, about the fact that you used to be an atheist and then you moved toward religion. So, what was it that drove you toward religious thought in the first place? Because usually you hear the opposite.
Yeah, what happened was that I was teaching. Introduction to philosophy classes, and I was teaching a philosophy religion class, and I was an atheist at the time. And so because you want students to be introduced to material that they're going to find interesting, especially since it might be the only philosophy class they ever take, I thought, well, everybody's interested in whether God exists, whether they have a negative or hostile interest in it or not. They're interested in the question whether God exists, even if they end up being atheists. So I thought, well, we'll cover Thomas Aquinas and some of the other traditional defenders of arguments for God's existence. But it got boring teaching this material and lining the arguments up and shooting them down with the standard objections that at the time I thought were good objections. So I thought, well, I'm going to try to make a bit of a horse race out of this, try to make it an interesting debate by seeing how far one could try to defend and make interesting the traditional arguments for God's existence. So I revisited the literature on that. I got back into the literature on Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and Leibniz and others in preparing my lectures and trying to make the arguments sound interesting, at least for a lecture or two, even though at the time I didn't find them convincing. And as time went on and I got deeper and deeper into this stuff, I realized that a lot of the objections that are standardly raised against the arguments are based on caricatures. They're just aimed at straw men, things that Aquinas and Leibniz and others never actually said. So the deeper I got into it, I went from thinking, well, these arguments are, they're not quite as bad as I had thought they were, to thinking, well, these arguments are actually kind of interesting, to thinking, well, these arguments are actually pretty powerful. And finally, at one point, it hit me, these guys were right all along, and I'd had them completely wrong. And most philosophers don't specialize in this stuff. They don't specialize in philosophy of religion. They may take a class or even just part of a class when they're undergrads, and they learn these stock objections, and then once and for all they dismiss the arguments and never revisit them. And I came to realize that most philosophers who comment on, and especially those who take a dismissive attitude about the arguments of an Aquinas or a Leibniz, they don't even really know the first thing. And their objections are typically aimed at straw men just as much as a sort of pop atheist like a Richard Dawkins or a Sam Harris might direct his arguments at straw men. So that played a big role in bringing me back to a belief in God.
So, Professor Feser, one of the things that you don't do in these books is defend biblical realism. So the idea that so I just want to put that off the table for the moment, because that's not what you're talking about in these books. So if people are picking these books up because they want a defense of Sinai or a defense of Jesus, that's not what these books are. These books are a defense of the general notion of the presence of a God who fulfills all of the same criteria as the biblical monotheistic God: omnipotent, omniscient, existing outside of time. And you explain in a rationalist way why it is imperative why rationality basically mandates that these things exist. It seems like a lot of the arguments in 5 Proofs of the Existence of God basically boil down to avoiding the infinite regress, and meaning that the caricature of the argument that is usually used for God is, well, you guys say that everything was created and therefore there need to be a God, because we can't just infinitely regress from object to object, and so there has to be a stopping point. And so there's this idea of the unmoved mover. The boiling down of the Aristotelian argument is that there's an unmoved mover. There's like a rock at the very beginning that started all of the dominoes moving, and we have to posit the existence of the rock, otherwise we can't explain all the dominoes moving. But the objection that is most commonly raised, and you address it in 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, and I think it'd be worthwhile to address it here, is, well, why does there have to be a rock at all? Like, what created the rock? What made the rock move? Did the rock move itself? Why can't it just be an infinite regress of causes forever?
Yeah, this is one of the caricatures. In fact, it's probably the biggest caricature and straw man that atheists typically direct their fire at. It's a personal pet peeve of mine. And that's the idea that these arguments rest on the premise that everything has a cause. And then the atheist naturally goes on to say, well, if everything has a cause, then what caused God? And if you say that nothing caused God, then why shouldn't you just go ahead and say nothing caused the universe? The problem with that objection, though, is it's aimed at a straw man. No defender of a first cause argument for God's existence in the history of philosophy ever gives this dumb argument. Everything is a cause, the universe has a cause. And it's interesting that when people attack this argument, they never give a citation. They never quote where they got it from. They never quote a line from Aquinas or Leibniz or Duns Scotus or Aristotle or any of these guys, because they never said that. They never say everything has a cause. What they say is something like, what goes from potential to actual has a cause, or what is contingent, meaning what exists but could have failed to exist in principle. What's contingent requires a cause. Or they say what comes into being has a cause. But that's as different from saying that everything has a cause as saying that triangles have three sides is different from saying that all geometrical figures have three sides. So part of the problem there is just a straw man. Once you properly understand the argument, though, if you just take the Aristotelian argument, for example, which rests in part on the premise that what goes from potential to actual has a cause, then the idea is that when we trace the series of things being actualized, so my coffee cup has got coffee in it and it's growing cold, and that involves the liquid going from being potentially cold to actually cold. Okay, and so something has to actualize that potential. But more fundamentally, the very existence of the water in the cup, the water in the coffee, or of the cup itself has to be actualized. And it has to be actualized here and now by something else going on here and now. The idea is that when you keep appealing to one thing being actualized by another, which is actualized by another, and so forth, you're passing the metaphysical buck, as it were. You're not really explaining anything, you're deferring the explanation. And so until you get to something that can actualize without itself being actualized, something which can do that precisely because it has no potentiality in it at all to be actualized. It always and already is, as it were, fully actual. Until you get to that, you don't really have an explanation any more than, say, if you, yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that was interesting is I was just speaking at University of Utah, and this exact topic came up. And the atheist that I was talking to eventually ended up coming back around to what is the most common response to this, which is the Bertrand Russell, okay, so eventually it's just a brute fact, right? So there's just, you eventually hit the brute fact wall, and that's it. Like, there was a fact, that fact started everything, you can't get beyond that fact. And it seems to me that what's so funny is that a lot of atheists accuse people who are religious of being in favor of a God of the gaps, that where we don't know, we fill it with God. It seems to me that brute facts is basically a God of the gaps. You're basically throwing up your hands and saying, okay, well, brute facts. Well, what's different about that than just throwing up your hands and saying, okay, God? What's the difference there?
Yeah, I would say that, as I argue in the book, there are at least two problems with this brute fact response. First of all, it's entirely arbitrary and has no motivation whatsoever other than as a way to try to avoid having to admit the existence of God, right? So no one in any other context would admit or would allow as a serious response the objection that, well, it's just a brute fact, right? I mean, if you mix two chemicals together in the chemistry lab and an explosion occurs, and the professor says, what were you guys doing, right? The student says, well, it's just a brute fact, professor, that the explosion occurred. No explanation. You wouldn't say, oh, yeah, maybe you're right. Yeah, I have read David Hume, right? Nobody would take that seriously in a context like that. The only place where people start saying, well, maybe it's just a brute fact is when they get to the existence of a necessary being that keeps the whole world together. In other words, when they get to the existence of God. Then suddenly they start thinking, well, maybe there are brute facts after all. So it's a completely arbitrary and not independently motivated objection. That's one problem. Another problem with it, though, is that the minute you allow in brute facts at all into the world, as I argue in the book, it ends up sort of eating away. It's a universal acid that eats away at all explanation. It takes down all scientific explanation with it. Because if you're going to say, for example, I mean, Bertrand Russell says this, J.L. Mackie, who's otherwise a pretty formidable atheist, Mackie says this as well, though, and I think this is a lapse of his. They both say, well, we can explain everything that occurs in the world by taking it down to deeper and deeper laws of nature. But when we get to the deepest level of laws of nature, whatever they turn out to be, well, that's just a brute fact, right? Problem with that is that if the higher level laws of nature rest on the lower level ones and those on some lower level ones, but when you get to the bottom, you get to something that has no intelligibility or explanation at all, it's just a brute fact, then that sort of takes down the explanatory force of everything above it. It's like, carefully putting a book on a shelf so it won't fall, carefully putting that shelf on some brackets so the shelf doesn't fall, carefully attaching those brackets to further brackets so they don't fall. and then instead of screwing the brackets into the wall, just letting them hang there in midair. Well, the whole thing's going to fall down and take the book down with it. You can't have an ultimate explanation until you get to something that is self-explanatory. Of its very nature, it couldn't be otherwise. In other words, something like God, rather than just saying it's a brute fact. Allowing a little bruteness into the world, you might say, it's like being a little pregnant. There's no, no such thing as a little bit of brute fact in the world. You let a little bit in and it takes the whole thing down.
Okay, so Professor Feser, who's the author of 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, you should go buy it right now. And he's also the author of a book, The Last Superstition, which is also a terrific book, which I've recommended on the show. I want to ask you something that's a little bit off topic from this particular argument, but one that seems to be gaining increased steam, and I think that really poses a danger to civilization, aside from the normal dangers that atheism poses to morality. And that is the view of free will that seems to be cropping up among a lot of neuroscientists that basically say that free will doesn't exist because there are things like the Libet test that suggest that your brain activity actually occurs before you're consciously aware that you're making a decision. The questions of free will, to me, this is the root of all civilization, and it's the greatest danger that's being posed by modern science. How do you respond to suggestions that basically we're all animals, we're firing, our neurons are firing, we're not in control of those neurons, we may be self-aware to the extent that we know what's happening to us or think we know what's happening to us, but we are, as Spinoza said, basically rocks sailing through the universe thinking that we threw ourselves, but we didn't throw ourselves, we're just aware that we're flying. What's the free will response? Is it compatibilism? Is it indeterminism? How do we square neuroscience and how the brain functions with the idea that we have the capacity to choose otherwise?
Well, yeah, that's a big topic. I mean, one of the things I would say in response initially is that I think all the arguments that people give from neuroscience against the existence of free will are really exercises in sophistry, and they contain all kinds of unexamined philosophical assumptions. There's a really good book by a guy named Alfred Mealy called Free, Why Science Hasn't Disproved Free Will. It's like 100 pages or less, really good exposition of arguments like Benjamin Libet's criticism of free will, and Mealy does a pretty good job of undermining those arguments. And one of the things he points out is how deeply those arguments make philosophical assumptions that they don't justify. They simply take for granted a certain interpretation of the neuroscientific evidence, right? So in the case of the Libet experiments, for example, he's got this experimental setup where he's got subjects who are supposed to, if I remember the setup correctly, it's been a little while since I looked at this, but they're supposed to, press a certain button after they feel an urge to do so, and then they report when they had the urge and when they go ahead and press the button, say, or they might be look at some spot of light on a dial or something. I think that might be what it is. And then Libet concludes from this that, well, when we measure what's happening, the neural activity that seems to be associated with the action, with their response, seems to occur slightly, milliseconds before the time that they report having a sensation of choice or a feeling of actually going ahead and following through with the action that he asked them to do. So he says since the neurological activity preceded the report of their choice, it must be this unconscious neural activity that precedes their choice that is really responsible for the action, and free will has nothing to do with it. Okay. Well, that's one way to interpret that evidence, but there are all kinds of other ways to interpret it that Mealy spells out in the book, one of which is this, that it could be, one problem with this, as Mealy points out, is that Libet only really looked for cases where the neurological activity occurred and then the action followed. But he doesn't he doesn't look for cases where the neurological activity occurs and then no response follows. So for all Libet's evidence shows, it might be that the neurological activity that he measured is a necessary condition for the action, but not a sufficient one. Maybe you need the neurological activity together with a separate act of free choice. There's nothing in the evidence that he appeals to that rules that possibility out. There's also the fact that he's got a very crude model of what a free choice is. Seems to think that a free choice is something that involves this full-on, explicit, conscious thought, I am now going to make a choice. Well, most of our free choices are not like that. As I'm talking to you now, I don't think, okay, now I'm going to move my lips up, now I'm going to close them, now I'm going to move them up. I just talk, and I'm doing it freely in the ordinary sense of free choice, but without it being this full-on conscious decision. So insofar as Libet's looking for some full-on consciously reportable decision and asks his subjects to report that, he's really aiming he's really aiming at a kind of caricature of what free choice involves. Okay, so those are a couple of problems of several, and there are many others that Mealy points out in the book. That's one problem. Another problem I would point out with these neurological arguments is that they're really only capturing an aspect of the full story. Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophers traditionally distinguish four components of a complete explanation. There's the material cause of a thing, the stuff out of which a thing is made. There's the formal cause, the form or pattern that stuff is taken on. So you can think of a rubber ball. The material cause would be the rubber, the matter that it's made out of. The formal cause might be the spherical and solid pattern that it's taken on. There's the efficient cause, what brings the ball into existence, and then there's the final cause, the end or purpose of the ball, which is to function as a toy. Okay, what modern neuroscientists are essentially doing, to a very large extent, I don't want to say everything they say fits into this description, but to a large extent, they're studying material and efficient causes of our actions, but not formal and final causes. So they're really only looking at half the story. It's like imagine an art critic who only studies the chemistry of the pigments of the ink or of the paint in the painting he's looking at and thinks that he can deduce from that all the significance of the painting. Well, he's studying the material cause of the painting, but he's not covering every aspect of the painting, and he's leaving out the most important aspect. In the same way, a neuroscientist who looks only at the level of neural wiring and the like and motor responses is only looking at part of the complete story of human action. So if he doesn't find free will there, he's looking at the wrong place. Just like if you look for the significance of a painting in the chemistry of the pigments, you're looking in the wrong place. Of course, you're not going to find it there.
Well, all of this is fascinating, and I love that it's great that I can ask you these questions because you're so fluent in all of these different areas of philosophy. Again, the book is 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The book goes through exactly what it promises. There are 5 different proofs: the Aristotelian, the Neoplatonic, the Augustinian, the Thomistic, and the Rationalist. And it really is fascinating. So you should go out and you should buy it right now. You should get Professor Feser's books as soon as they come out. I mean, he's become in 3 short weeks. I've read a couple of his books, and he's become one of my favorite authors, and obviously a very wise man who spent an awful lot of time thinking about these issues, much more than I think that most people do, especially people who read pop atheist books or pop religion books. Professor Feser, thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope that we boost you on Amazon a little bit.
Thanks a lot. It was great being here.
Thanks so much.